WorldDenver talks today with Joseph Cirincione, the president of the Ploughshares Fund, a public grant-making foundation focused on nuclear weapons policy and conflict resolution. He is a member of Secretary of State John Kerry's International Security Advisory Board and the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of several important books on the threat of nuclear weapons, including his most recent, Nuclear Nightmares. Welcome to Denver, Joe.
Well, thank you very much.
Let's start with the magnitude of the problem. How many nations are in what you call the nuclear weapons club right now?
We have 9 countries that currently have nuclear weapons, and they range from the United States and Russia, which have about 95% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. And they have stockpiles of around 8,000 weapons each, all the way down to North Korea, the newest member of the club. And they have enough material for perhaps 2 to 4 nuclear bombs.
And how many are outside the door waiting to get into the club?
Well, this is really the good news. There used to be a lot of countries interested in programs. In the 60s, there were about 23 nations that were researching or had nuclear weapons programs. We're actually down to the last 2 hard cases, North Korea, which has actually tested a couple of bombs, and Iran, which has a program that could be turned towards nuclear weapons. They deny it, but it's really those 2 hard cases. If you can stop them, you can really talk about the end of proliferation, the end of this wave of more and more countries getting nuclear weapons that began 69 years ago with Hiroshima.
So you write in your book that there are about 17,300 weapons, I think, in the global stockpile. Do you have any idea how much investment this represents? What kind of money would have gone into developing a stockpile like that?
An author named Stephen Schwartz at the Brookings Institution did something a few years ago called Atomic Audit, and he tallied up how much we had spent, the United States, and he came up with a figure of almost $6 trillion it's cost us for our nuclear weapons. That is a continuing price tag. The programs we're currently planning for the United States arsenal are going to cost another $1 trillion over the next 30 years or so. If you look at everybody's weapons altogether, all the countries that have nuclear weapons are probably going to spend about $1 trillion over the next 10 years to keep and modernize those programs. So it's a lot of money.
Who has the most dangerous weapons?
Pakistan, without question. I know people think about North Korea, crazy leader, Iran. Almost every story you read about nuclear policy mentions Iran, but it's really Pakistan. They have 100 weapons right now. They have enough material for 100 more. They have an unstable government, a collapsing economy, strong Islamic fundamentalist influences in their military and intelligence structure. Oh, and Al-Qaeda operating in the territory of Pakistan, and Al-Qaeda-like organizations allied with them. The danger is not that Pakistan might lose control of the weapons currently, it's that the government might collapse, the country could destabilize, and then it'd be a race to get the bombs, and you don't want to think about what it'd be like to have Al-Qaeda with nuclear weapons.
No. What would you say are the biggest impediments to worldwide nuclear disarmament?
The bomb is 69 years old this July. 69 years ago, we did the first test in Trinity, the Trinity test out in New Mexico, and we grew up for decades with this Cold War view that these were necessary for our security, and people still cling to those outmoded ideas that somehow nuclear weapons will protect us. There's a shift going on, and many, many national security experts now believe that nuclear weapons, whatever benefit they may have had during the Cold War, now represent a security threat, not a security benefit. So that's number one. Number two, you have Russia. Russia's been our rival for all these years, and in some ways they still are, even though they no longer represent that threat. But we still have this old view that we have to keep parity with them. So they have 8,000, we have to have 8,000. I think this is wrong. I think we should decouple our strategy from Russia, but that's still the way it is. And finally, there's money. There's money. These are defense programs, after all. People make a lot of money building nuclear weapons and the missiles, bombers, and subs that go on them, so they have a vested interest in keeping those programs going.
So do you think this recent development with Ukraine has pushed us back into that Cold War mentality and maybe set back the hope that some sort of disarmament deal could be made?
No question about it. I mean, that the chill in U.S.-Russian relations are making it less likely that Russia will agree to any further reductions, at least for the next couple of years or so. So it's definitely set back the promising process that was begun under President Bush and President Obama to ratchet down our Cold War arsenals.
What would it look like for the U.S. to become an effective leader in global disarmament?
I think we have three examples of this. One is John F. Kennedy. I mean, his famous saying that we have to eliminate the weapons of war before they eliminate us. And when he made those statements, he really started what we now know as the non-proliferation regime. He helped create the framework that got countries together to agree that those that didn't have the bomb wouldn't build them, and those that did have the bomb would start to disarm. The second example is Ronald Reagan. People think of him as a cold warrior, which he was in his first term. In his second term, he was the greatest arms control president we ever had. He slashed the U.S. and Russian arsenals by 50%. I mean, he really led the way. Ever since then, ever since the mid-'80s, our stockpiles have come down. There used to be 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. We're down to 17,000, mainly because of what Ronald Reagan did. And finally, there's President Obama. In his first year in office, in April of 2009, he gave a speech at Prague that just electrified the world, talking about the vision of the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. And in the first 2 years of his administration, made great progress, reducing the arsenals, stopping new states from getting the weapons, and securing materials around the world so that terrorists couldn't get them. Unfortunately, he's kind of taken his eye off of the ball there. He's had other issues that he's turned to, and as a result, his agenda has stalled out. We'll see if he turns back to it in his last 2 years in office.
If we were to disarm, what would be the economic impact of that?
People think nuclear weapons are cheap, and it was one of the selling points in the early days that we didn't, instead of building tanks, we could build a nuclear weapon that would help defeat the other guy's tanks. Well, it turns out that we build the tanks and the nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons are very expensive all around the board. We spend about $55 billion every year on nuclear weapons and related programs. That's about a tenth of what we spend on national defense overall, so it's a lot of money. So if you were able to cut that, it would take a while, but you could save, over the next 10 years, you could save $100 billion easy just by slowing down the programs, and then the savings really start to mount up as you're no longer producing these weapons. So you could save hundreds of billions of dollars every year, either for weapons that you really need to fight the wars that we have to fight, or for social programs to provide the people of this country with the needs that are still in short supply. There is a cost. Taking apart nuclear weapons costs something. So there would be some costs initially in the disarmament process, but those are short-term costs, and they're over with pretty quickly as compared to the weapons, which are around for 40, 50 years and have to be paid for, maintained, operated, modernized every year.
Well, we have a pretty big defense industry here in Colorado. What about jobs? What about the loss of jobs? How would that impact the economy?
Well, we've seen this happen in states around the country where that used to have nuclear bases in them, for example, and that shifted. There used to be a nuclear missile base in Arkansas. They got rid of it a long time ago. There used to be nuclear missions associated with many more of our bomber fleet, and they've been reduced down to just 100 or so nuclear-related bombers. And those missions have been replaced by other more urgent missions. So as we start to reduce the defense budget, the pressure is really going to intensify. The Joint Chiefs don't mind spending money on nuclear weapons or missile defense as long as the budget's increasing. But the budget's not increasing anymore. It's doubled over the last 10 years. It's starting to come down, and that's going to force choices. So it's not a question of cutting the jobs. It's a question of which jobs do you want to maintain? Which missions? Which officer billets? The ones that you really need for the planes, tanks, and ships, or this obsolete force from a Cold War that's been over for 20, 30 years.
You expect this would be supported by the generals, by the Pentagon?
I've seen it time and time again. As the budget shifts and the Joint Chiefs choose they don't choose nuclear. They choose the things that they really need. So I expect this budget pressure over the next 10 years to be forcing these policy choices.